Okay, so Parshas B'Shalach, minog of Klal Yisrael is to feed the birds. As I'm sure I was about to say all your kids will be coming home from Gan with the bird feeders, but I don't think your kids are coming home from whatever with bird feeders. But let's discuss where this comes from, what this comes from, and what in the world does that have to do with Parshas B'Shalach. And of course, what we're really going to hone in on is the halachic implications, meaning, are you allowed to feed animals on Shabbos? That's really the sugya that we're going to get to. But before we even get there, this part you don't have on the paper in front of you, just one dot of background is why. Why all of a sudden on Shabbos Shira has this minhag developed? And for those who are going to say, nah, there's no such minhag, we'll see clearly there was such a minhag, as we're going to see in a moment from how all the Paiskim are perhaps writing against the minhag, but there is clearly a minhag, which we're going to get to in one moment. So just what's the reason? So very fascinating. Taisus Shabbos writes, you know why? Because the margla bepumayu sha'ifais shir bayam. The birds sang shira by the yam, and therefore, because the birds sang shira by the yam, therefore we give the birds food. Aruch HaShulchan says, but it's cute. I don't know if anyone was listening what he said. Aruch HaShulchan, I'll read him. The margla bepi hehamayin. People say. Interesting. Aruch HaShulchan, you're supposed to tell us what people say. He is quoting the people say, and therefore we are machzik taiva to them and we give them food. Interesting that is his makar, that people say that the shir of the yam. And what does everyone remember from the elementary school days? Why do we give? No one remembers? Dasan Aviram, the man, the what?
The birds went out.
The birds went out, and Dasan Aviram wanted to whatever, and the birds went out and they ate the man. I don't know what preschool you went to. Let's not say that in public. So what's interesting is we the Nemukei Arachaim, who is I think the Munkatcher, Chassidish Sefer, he writes that the reason is, and he heard this from Harav Agayin HaKadosh, Rav Mendel Mirinov, the Rinov Rebbe, and he says that the reason is because Dasan Aviram Ratzu B'Rish Asam Lahachish Divri Nevias Moshe Rabbeinu. Dasan Aviram wanted to contradict the Nevi'as of Moshe Rabbeinu. K'shahigi the Moshe Kibul El Yom Hashvila Yernaman. Moshe Rabbeinu says there's going to be no man on Shabbos. Ki Shabbos Kaideshu. Hey, Dasan Aviram Moshe B'Tachmu Lo Yisam. V'Kamu B'Layla. They got up and I do Pazur Me'amoin, and they spread them on all over. Shenishar Lahem. They're left over Manik Lachem Erev Shabbos Al Aretz. K'teshut L'Eretz of the Yam. She'ir B'Layla B'El Shabbos Kaidesh. So Dasan Aviram wanted what? Wanted to contradict Moshe Rabbeinu. So he spread out the man so everyone thinks Moshe is wrong. Vati Pairim, and comes the birds, Laktu, Zais, Kaidim, Arayim. And the birds came and they ate up all the man, Ksharatu, Arashayim. The dozen Avirim, Babaikir, Shabbos Kaidesh, Laharis Le'am, they came to say, hey, look, everyone look, there's man. They realized there is no man. And that's the reason why we give the birdies food on Shabbos Shira, Because Atam Parshas B'Shalach Shekern Parshas Haman Al Kein Noisin Latziparan Chalkom Ksas Mimacholi HaShabbos Lezecher Anis. So it's interesting. It's not what Aruch HaShulchan said. It's not what the Taisus Shabbos says. But this is, of course, I believe, what all the Moras and Ganenets teach us. So now that we see that there is some sort of minhag to this, let's understand. Are you allowed to do this in Shabbos? Are you allowed to feed animals on Shabbos? That is what we're going to talk about for the next few moments. This all begins, if you like, just look at the papers in front of you. This all begins with a Gemara in Shabbos, Daf, I can't see my Gemara, Daf Kufnun Hey Amid Beis. Says the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kufnun Hey Amid Beis. It's a Mishnah, Ein Oivsin es a gamol, Ervin as well, V'lo darsin, and you're not allowed to feed all your animals. Now, why are you not allowed to feed the animals? Why not? So comes along Rashi, now there's another Gemara that says, when is this Isser applicable? Because anyone here who has an animal is currently wondering, of course you feed animals. When do you feed animals? if you have an animal?
Before you eat.
Even before you eat? This is one of the examples brought down in Shulchan Aruch that if someone washes and he realizes, we didn't feed Fido the dog. You got to go and feed Fido. And you even let it talk for it. Not necessarily ask to pass the salt, which Rosh Steinberg says you're not allowed to do. So no one should profess their incredible knowledge in halacha and padavka. Please pass the salt, and I'm allowed to talk right now and give a whole shir. Yeah, people do say you're allowed to. But once Rosh Steinberg says not to, it's not the area. No, my point is it's not the area to profess your incredible knowledge in halacha by saying, I washed, but I know the halacha is that you're allowed to pass the salt. It's a little bit silly if it's not a conclusive halacha, you shouldn't be doing that. But either way, comes along, no great hana. Comes along the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Ham and Beis, and the Gemara teaches that you're only not allowed to feed an animal that is ein mizaynaisav alecha. Ein mizaynaisav alecha. But if the mizaynaisav is alecha, then you're allowed to feed the animal. So for example, if someone has, are you allowed to own a dog?
No.
Depends. Is it a dog that bites on a chain?
And some say what? You have to make sure it's on a chain. Oh, very good, very good. Just making sure you were listening and watching. So, forget about a dog, a cat, goldfish, whatever you're going to feed. It's only if mizaynaisav halecha. It comes on the Shulchan Aruch and Shin Chaf Dalid Sif Yud Aleph says the Shulchan Aruch ein neis mayim luminayis lefi devayrim, front of the bees, lefnei yoynei shevach, land from the birds, lobnei chazir. Aval, what are you allowed to feed? Avazim v'tarnegailim. Why? Because mizaynaisav alecha. Because they are dependent upon you for food, and therefore you're allowed to feed them. So why is it usr? Where does this isser come from? This is one of those fundamental Shabbos. When you learn Hilchah Shabbos, you try to figure out certain things are usr. Why is it usr? So we have a machlokes over here. What is the isser? Taisus learns the isser is tircha. You have an excessive bother on Shabbos, you're not allowed to be matriach. And whenever we learn Hilchah Shabbos, you'll realize where tircha in Hilchah Shabbos doesn't mean sweating, doesn't mean schlepping. It means something that you're not allowed to do is often defined as a tircha on Shabbos. That is what Taisvis says. The Rambam gives a different reason, and obviously this is the first cousin to everything we've been talking about. What halachas have we been talking about? Refuah. Why is there an Isra refuah? Because you might come to, you brought in the porter and the mestel, the pestle and the mortar. Because you might come to grind. The Rambam says, you know why you're not allowed to feed animals? Because you might come to prepare animal food, which often involves malacha, like lisha, like kneading ukiyaitzabay. And by the way, that's a real fact. I know everyone here who has animals. I do not. But there are malachas sometimes that are required preparing animal food, and it's something to be mindful for. So says the Rambam, the reason you're not allowed to feed an animal unless it's dependent upon you is because we're afraid you might come do malacha. L'maisa, l'alacha, l'maisa, l'mishtabura. 1 second. What do you say?
If it's dependent on you, then it's
No, so the answer is they made a gzeira dirabanan. When it's not dependent on you, you're not allowed to do it because the gzeira ought to. If it's your own animal, then of course we have to do that. Which, by the way, the Tzar Balachayim is a tzad deraisa on the Torah. Tzar Balachayim is a very real thing. Mishnah Berurah points out that we go with the reason of tircha yisera. Fine. So why is it also to feed an animal that's not dependent upon you? Because of tircha. Now, what's very interesting.
So it's no tircha?
No. The reason it is usher to feed an animal is because it is tircha. To feed an animal that does not need your food is tircha.
So a person can't feed his dog on Shabbos?
If it's not dependent upon you. Good. Let's answer your question. It comes on, 1 second. Everyone's asking the same question. We just have to listen. Comes on the Mishnah Berurah, Sifkat al-Chavtes. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what if you have an animal that is dependent upon you? But if you don't feed it, what's going to happen? Oh, just go outside and find food in the garbage can. You have a cat in Eretz Yisrael. So you love your cat. Why, I don't know. But you go and you feed your cat every single morning religiously. What would happen if you don't feed your cat? Well, do what all the other cats in Yerushalayim do, which is what? Go to the garbage cans and eat. Slow. Why is it causing tzar to eat? They get the food that they get in those garbage cans. Kenai nahara. Exactly. Kenai nahara. So now, that's because the yeshiva bachram had too much fun with it. But either way, comes along the Mishnah Berurah, and Mishnah Berurah points out it's only something that it really needs you. And if it doesn't really need you and it can get food without you, then that is called a tirsha shalei l'tzeirich. So we can't quantify the Isser as being your animal versus not your animal. The Aruch HaShulchan says the flip side. What's the flip side? Flip side is you're walking home one day and you want to be a gadol. So, there's different ways of being gedolim. Some people learn Torah like gedolim. Some people do chasadim. Some people find one story that they could be like a gadol, which is a beautiful thing also, right? So I think everyone has seen the story. I think it was a picture of Chaim Kanievsky feeding an animal a bowl of milk. So you come home one day and there's a cat sitting by your front door and it's sitting there crying and whining. And you're trying to figure out what in the world does the cat need? And eventually you realize the cat is starving. So you figure, you remember the story of Rav Chaim, so at least episode could be like Rav Chaim. So what do? But wait, it's not your cat. Are you allowed to go get this cat milk? So the answer to this question is, it's not dependent, is it me or not me. It's dependent, does the animal need my stuff? And if the cat is sitting there, now how you know if the cat is crying for milk, I do not know. But if the cat is sitting there clearly needing your food, says the Aruch HaShulchan, which is the flip side of what we just said, then it's going to be mutter. So again, to quantify the Isser is because of tircha. When is it Asr? If the animal does not need you. If the animal needs you, then it is mutter. Based on this, really we should end the shir right now, which is what the Mishnah Berurah comes along and says, am I allowed to go on Shabbos and take my challah and throw it out to the birds? Says the Mishnah Berurah, absolutely not. Says we begin with the Magen Avram, and the Magen Avram says, yesh noyagin. And of course, whenever we find that the Pais keeps saying there are those that do this, that means that there were those that do this. The yesh noyagin, what? To give chit and wheat to the Shabbos Shira before the birds. Says the Magen Avram, einoi nachain, it's incorrect. Why? Because the birds don't eat your food. And the Mishnah Berurah in Sefkat Lamed Aleph quotes this Magen Avram, and he says, einoi nachain, it's the wrong thing to do. So that's what one would have thought, and therefore, once I said slow, before we get questions, I want to make sure it's clear. We'll take questions in a moment. So therefore, are you allowed to feed the birds? One would have said no. Comes along the Aruch HaShulchan and says the Aruch HaShulchan, probably screaming at the Mishnah Berurah, Yesh misra amim al masha minig b'Shabbos Shira lizu chitan they are oirfais. There are those that scream to those who feed the chitin to the birds. Shari ein mizay neisav alecha, in parentheses he quotes the Magen Avram, which is also the Mishnah Berurah. Says Aruch HaShulchan, avanira li te minog Yisrael Torah. Minog Yisrael Torah. Says Aruch HaShulchan, if this is your minog, you are allowed to do it. Based on the poll that we took at the beginning of this year, it's certainly not any of yours minog. So no one could say, the Aruch HaShulchan said minog Yisrael Torah, so now I could go feed the birds. That's obviously ridiculous. But if one were to have such a minog, and again, I don't think the minog is created by the fact that when your child turns 4 and brings home the gift from preschool, now I have a minog, I have to do it. So the question is, and with this we're going to conclude, the Tosfos Shabbos actually comes along and says that what we just said, and he says the reason why, I actually didn't quote here the right part of the Tosfos Shabbos.
So
So the Aruch HaShulchan is talking about on Shabbos. That's Aruch HaShulchan. He's coming against the Magen Avram that says don't feed them on Shabbos, and he says there's a minute to do it. We're going about to stapler, so like you said, let's get there in one moment, and maybe that's what you're remembering it from a child, Baruch Hashem. So the Tosfos Shabbos comes along and says, he does say, l'shem mitzvah. So Shabbos wants to point out that maybe the reason it's mutter, it's l'shem mitzvah, that which would mean on 50, how many weeks are there in a year? Good. So 51 weeks of the year to go and feed the birds, it's Asr, says Shabbos. On Shabbos Shira, cause you're doing it for the mitzvah. That what? Because the bird said Shira Layam, then perhaps it would be minog. That's why he says, Kain nearly yashev minog, to answer up the minog. And therefore, again, if someone has the minog, they were able to continue. Now, Lamaisa comes on the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish says, the reason why maybe people are doing it? Because of the Shita of the Ran. And the Shita of the Ran is very interesting. We kept saying that you're feeding the birds a chitin wheat. Do birds normally eat wheat? No. You're feeding the cat milk. Do cats normally get milk? No. Says the Shita of the Ran, the Chedushi Ran, or Chazon Ish says maybe this is what they're making on, that the heter is if you're feeding them something that they don't normally get. Interesting heter, even though it's ein mizaynis of alecha, says the Ran, mashalim yud mizaynis l'shchichi, if it's not common, then you'd be allowed to feed them. Lamaisa comes on the Archas Rabbeinu, comes along the stapler, and the stapler says, you should do? Give it to them on Sunday. So everyone who forgets to put out the bird feeder before Shabbos and the child is crying, you say, no, the minhag is to do it on Sunday. That's what the stapler says. Why? A good question. Why does the stapler say Sunday? I don't know. Why not just do it on Friday? Good question. Maybe it was a hectic Erev Shabbos in the home of the stapler. L'maisa archa shol, the Shemir Shabbos is a fascinating eitzah with this we conclude. Says the Shemir Shabbos, it's Friday night, and you just finished the Suda and Oiveh. You forgot to feed the birds, and you feel so bad. You said Shira Shirim that Shabbos, and you said Aziyah Shira, as some people have this special minhag, and Avad, you said Parshas Amon this past week, and you're feeling all bad, and someone told you that the school of Parshas Amon is only if you go and you feed the birds, and you're like, Oiveh, the whole thing is over. So what can you do now? What can you do now? Says the Shmir Shabbos, you know what you could do? You could take your tablecloth with all the crumbs, Mutter linaer mapa minabirum sha'aleha, if you have an Erev, obviously, and then the birds will eat it. Even though, and he says a nice lumdus. What's the whole Isser? Now we can say what you said before. The whole Isser is because of tircha. So if I'm doing it not for that reason, I'm doing it to clean off my tablecloth. I'm doing it just, I have a tablecloth and I need to clean it off. So I'm doing it in a way that the birds will also get, says the Shmir Shabbos, that one could do. So in summation, Lamaisa, are you allowed to feed animals on Shabbos? That would be, very good. By the way, is that to every Shabbos? There are some that are Ma'orer. The Shmir Shabbos obviously argues that maybe there's an Isser Zoyreh, which is spreading things in the wind. If you take your tablecloth with the crumbs on Shabbos, L'maisa, we see clearly the Shmir Shabbos holds that is mutter. So in summation, to feed animals on Shabbos in generally is forbidden unless the animals are dependent upon you, or if you see that the animal really needs your food. Even on Shabbos Shira, clearly there was a minhag. There's no question about that. Why? Either it's a mitzvah, either it's because they sang Shira Layam, or it's a machzik toiva. We work on our karas ha'toiv when we go and we feed the birds. L'maisa, if one does not have the minhag, I don't believe it's the right time to dive into this Aruch HaShulchan. If you don't have the minhag, it would seem like you're more in the camp of the Mishnah Berurah on this one. And you should not feed the birds on Shabbos. What do? Either you do like the stapler and you feed the birds on Sunday. The truth is, Rabbi Flam, you were suggesting to feed them on Friday. L'maisa, it could be the reason he didn't want to do that is because you want to make sure the birds eat it on Shabbos. So they said to give it to them Erev Shabbos, Samach L'Chasheich, another thing to do, in those critical moments before Shkia, as you're getting out of the shower, shaving, setting up your wife candlelight, putting the crockpot up all within the 10 minutes before Shkia, while you're supposed to have been at Shul davening Mincha. So, putting the tea lights underneath the towel so you get hot soup. Says Rav Saraya Devlitsky that he quotes this Mishnah Berurah, and he says that you you could do Ani noyig ezeh gamkin aval ani sam me erev Shabbos. So he says I had the minhag, but I did it on Erev Shabbos. Now, if you want a cute eitzah, you could pull the birthday. You could do the happy birthday eitzahs that you cover over the food, and then on Shabbos you could go and you could open it up. He says, "Ratzalaimer the little cup itchy megula dafka b'Shabbos." So there were those who would do that. They would cover it over on Shabbos morning. Go out, open it up. Birds go and eat. Then they're going to be eating on Shabbos. It's a shayla if you're allowed to even do that because. Very good. So the Sefer the Nishma Shabbos comes along and he says, no, that's okay. Says you're not doing a maisa with the food itself, so he says that's okay. Halach lemaisa, what should he do? What you should do is make the kids happy. Make sure whatever they bring home you use. Whatever you use. And the kids don't really chop, you know what I'm saying? You put it out on the windowsill, the window's closed. The birds can eat through the window. And they wake up Shabbos morning, you spill some of them out, and you tell the kid, look at that. Just like Eliyahu Hanavi comes Leil Pesach and drinks the wine, the Heliga birds. But the ikar, of course, is to be machzik taiva, to work on our karas ha'toiv, to realize the wonderful taiva that they did, and to learn a little bit halacha. Shkoyah.